All right, welcome to Truth Seekers. Thank you all for coming out or watching our show later. This is a ministry of the disciples of Yahweh in Jesus Christ. I'm Scott Walton, and my brother Jody Bishop and we are the disciples. Tonight we have a special guest to talk about the soul. The purpose of this meeting, Truth Seekers, is we're teaching Christians apologetics to share the gospel for witness evangelism and missions. We are a new ministry, and this is a new program. We do pray for your support, and we thank you for all that you do. We ask that you please pray for us, subscribe to our YouTube channel, like any videos that you like, and share them in forums where people are discussing those topics. And tonight, now here to introduce our speaker is Brother Jody.
Thank you, Brother Scott, and we really appreciate everyone joining us. And like Scott said, keep us in your prayers. Pray that we can reach, millions of people for Christ. Pray that, God will use our ministry to, open doors up for unreached people groups that will, we will plant missionaries, plant people, and just, take this country back for Christ. And we got a very great speaker. He's got his own YouTube channel. You can find him at Eric Hernandez. He does a really great job on the soul. And if you want to watch his videos, then just watch his videos. And I turn it over to Eric Hernandez.
Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. Yep. So for the sake of time, let's jump in and just real quick, they said, my name is Eric Hernandez. I am the apologetics lead for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, which encompasses doing seminars and trainings with our churches all around the state of Texas in areas of apologetics and evangelism, and conducting 3 annual, what we call the Unapologetic Evangelism Conferences. So let's go ahead and jump in. Let me share my screen here. So to give some background to a foundation of how I even got into this, my freshman year of college, I took my first philosophy class, and I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. And I later came to find that my first professor was an atheist. But what I enjoyed was that he was very cordial. He was very respectful. And I was allowed to ask questions in the class, which was a contrast in some instances to the youth group I attended. Well, after learning about philosophy and wanting to learn more, I wanted to take my a second class the next semester. But then everybody warned me, if I was going to take another class, not to take Professor Peña class, because if I took his class, he was very antagonistic and condescending. And if I took his class, I might lose my faith, which excited me. And I wanted to sign up, not because, of course, I wanted to lose my faith, but because I was genuinely curious. I've always been inquisitive at a young age. And I knew in my mind that if Christianity were true, I needed to know why. But I also knew that if it were false, I'd still like to know why. And perhaps this guy would be the guy for the job. So here's the pivotal moment, pivotal class, if you will, that kind of set me on the path that I am now. One day he walks into class and he sits at the front of his desk like he usually would. And then he pretends to pull out this antidepressant pill from his pocket. And he says, now, according to religion, they want us to believe in some kind of an immaterial soul. And according to Christianity, this is a hope that we have in having an afterlife and seeing our family and friends that have passed away. He said, but the problem is that how is it that if the soul exists, how can something tiny and physical have the power to affect the immaterial soul? Because if my thoughts and feelings and moods are in my immaterial soul, and yet this antidepressant pill, which is physical, how can it have the ability to change or affect these states of my soul? Because every time we look at the body, the brain, we just see these neurons firing. And every time we look at the body under a microscope, all we see are the base elements and compounds of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but you never find anything like a soul. And how can that be? And he says, well, the answer is pretty simple, and I'll tell you why. The answer is that there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no afterlife. We're just a physical brain and body, and we need to learn to live with this fact and get on with our lives. Now, I was troubled by this because up until that point in my life, I had heard a lot of people complain about Christianity, and that's all they really were complaints. People would say something like, "Well, I'm not a Christian because Christians are hypocrites," or "I don't like what God did in the Old Testament." But all of these complaints could be true, and yet it wouldn't negate the fact that God existed or Christianity was true. However, the soul, when it came to this line of reasoning, it was different, and here's why. We see that Paul begins to talk about the resurrection. And in 1 Corinthians 15, he basically says that if there is no resurrection, then our faith is in vain and we should be pitied amongst all men. So essentially, Paul is saying that if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christianity would be false. So to reiterate, if there's no resurrection, then Christianity can't be true. Well, by the same line of reasoning, if there's no soul, I would argue there could be no resurrection, and thus, once again, Christianity would be false. So, what is a soul? Let's jump right in. The soul can be defined as an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness and animates the body. And we're going to focus on these 2 points right here. So, whenever I give a case for the soul, there are 2 basic points. The first is that consciousness is not physical. And the second is that I am more than a brain and body. I am a soul. So again, just laying the foundation here. Now, some people might interject immediately, say, hold on, hasn't science disproven our soul? Or hasn't scientists showed us that there was no soul? Or what, like my professor said, under a microscope, every time we look at the brain, we don't find a soul. We just find chemicals and neurons firing. Well, unfortunately, such a claim or accusation is what we would call a category fallacy. In other words, it's attributing a certain line of inquiry to a category that it does not belong to. Let me explain why. Suppose your neighbor calls you and he says, "There's an invisible man in my house." And being the skeptical person that you are, you say, "Let me come over, let me investigate for myself." So the neighbor lets you in and you spend about an hour just investigating every inch of the house. And after an hour passes, you come out really upset with your neighbor and you said, "I can't believe I wasted my time. You're a liar." And he says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well," and you say, "Well, you told me there was an invisible man in your house." And he says, "Yes, there is." And you say, "No, there's not." And he says, "Well, why would you say that?" And here's your answer. You say, "Well, because I looked in the attic, I looked in the closet, I looked in the bathroom, I looked into the bed, I looked everywhere I possibly could, and not once did I see this invisible man." Now, of course, the point here is that he's going to look at you with a really, really funny face and pretty much ask you, "Well, why would you expect to visibly see something that by definition cannot be seen?" Now, granted, this doesn't prove that there is an invisible man in your neighbor's house, but what it does show us is that if we want to disprove that there is no invisible man, we cannot appeal to the sense of visibility to try and disprove something that by definition cannot be visible. In the same way, science is a wonderful tool for studying the physical world. It's great. However, the soul, if it exists, is non-physical by definition, which means you cannot use science to study something which can only study the physical to try and investigate something that is non-physical. This would be like, as atheist philosopher of science Michael Roos said, "Science does not ask certain questions, so it is to no surprise that it does not give certain answers." So appealing to science to answer the question would be like trying to use a ruler to measure your weight. It is simply the wrong tool for the assessment. So what is the right tool? Well, a foundation to be set for going into the arguments for the soul and touching on my 2 basic points is going to encompass an understanding and grasp of something known as, the big long word is Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals, but for short, we'll just call it the law of identity, or Leibniz's law. Now, the law of identity states that if 2 things in question are the same, let's say some A and B, then whatever is true of one is going to be true of the other because they're the same thing. However, because of this principle, it also gives us a rule of thumb to understand that if we can find something true of one, of let's say B, that's not true of A, or vice versa, then by default, they cannot be the same thing. Let me illustrate. Suppose you walk into a lab And there are two bottles of clear fluids. One is labeled water and the other is labeled chemical X. Now, in philosophy, when we say two things are identical, that word identity means literally the same thing as. So, for example, Eric Hernandez is identical to the guest on your show, which basically means we're using two different titles to refer to the same person. So again, if you can find something true of one that's not true of the other, then they are apparently are not the same thing, because obviously everything true of me is going to be true of the guest because I am the guest on your show. So going back to these two bottles of clear fluid, let's say one says water and the other says chemical X. But let's say chemical X has its label scratched off, so you don't know what it is. And you want to ask yourself, are these two substances identical? Well, you note that they both have a clear fluid. So they both have the property of being clear. They both have the property of being liquid. So you think, well, thus far, I think they're the same substance. But suppose you turn over chemical X and it says caution flammable. And you think, okay, well, I know that water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what chemical X is, I know at the very least they cannot be the same thing. Now, with this in mind, let's look at the first point, that consciousness is not physical. Now, what is consciousness? Again, just another definition. Much like water can come in three states, a solid, liquid, and a gas, so too consciousness is something that comes in 5 different states, and they are thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and acts of will or volition. I can answer questions on that later, but just for the sake of time, you have 5 states of consciousness. And each of these 5 states are characterized by their properties. Just like water, when it is in a solid state, is going to have the property of being hard. When it's in a gas state, it's going to have the property of being a vapor. And when it's in a liquid state, it's going to have the property of fluidity. So the states of a thing are going to be characterized by certain properties. And when you know this, it tells you about the kind of nature that this thing in question is. Now, with this in mind, going back to what my professor said, if what he was saying was true, then he's essentially going to have to say that the mind is identical or reducible to, that is to say, nothing more than the brain. So if there is no God and there's no soul, then consciousness, if it exists, is going to have to be equal to something like the brain. Now, again, remember Leibniz's law of identity. If the mind is a brain, then whatever is true of one is going to be true of the other. But again, if I can find something true of one that is not true of the other, and vice versa, then we can show they're not the same thing. And this is trivially easy to do. So let's take one example. I'll give you 3. Let's take a state of my mind. My thoughts can be true or false, but no region of my brain is true or false. It makes no sense to look at my brain neurons firing and saying this group of neurons firing right here are false, but these group of neurons over here are true. It's a category fallacy. My brain can be in a state which weighs 3 pounds, but my belief or thoughts that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. We may be having heavy thoughts right now, but we're not going to buy a neck brace once this program is over. My brain can be in a state that is 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which are sensations, a state of my mind, the smell of a rose or the taste of banana is not 7 inches long. Now, I can give a dozen more examples, if not more, but the point is simple, and that is if all the properties of the mind and brain are different, if all the properties of the brain are physical and all the properties of the mind are not physical, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it cannot be physical. Now, again, lots more that can be said, but let's go back to what my professor said, because some people might say, okay, but wait a minute. Your professor alluded to something physical change in the mind, and we even know of cases where if you get brain damage and Alzheimer's, it can cause effects within your memory. Doesn't this prove that the mind is the same thing as a brain? And the short answer is no. Why? Because cause or dependence is not the same thing as identity. I find this is a very common misconception when it comes to consciousness and the soul. So let me explain. Suppose you get the world's greatest guitar player and he has a few popped guitar strings. Because of this, he will be unable to play the song on his guitar, which means we have now demonstrated that there is a cause and effect relationship and even a dependence relationship between a musician and his instrument. But just because we can demonstrate a cause and effect relationship between a guitarist and his guitar, would it follow that therefore he is a guitar? Well, no, of course not. But suppose he popped a few more strings, and not only was he unable to play the entire song, he could no longer play the note C. Does it follow from this that therefore, when we crack open the guitar, the note C is going to slip out? Well, no, of course not. So again, although there are a correlation and dependence relation between playing a song or playing notes in a song, it doesn't follow that they're the same thing, nor does it follow that one is inside of the other. In the same way, sure, you can affect the states of my brain, which will affect the states of my mind, but that's akin to detuning my guitar and changing the way the music's played. And similarly with the notes, just because there's a correlation and in some instances a dependence of the mind and brain, it doesn't mean that my thoughts are literally in my mind. A lot of people, even Christians, tend to be shocked when I tell them God doesn't have a brain. Of course not. He's not physical. We're not Mormons. We don't believe God has a physical body, and he thinks just fine. And of course, we're made in his image. I can touch more on that if you'd like later. So just because, again, we can develop a cause or dependent relationship between a musician and his guitar, it doesn't follow they're the same thing. And in the same way, just because you can show that these physical effects can cause and have effects on my mind, it doesn't follow they're the same thing, because as I mentioned earlier, cause or dependence is not the same thing as identity. All right. Now let's look at the second point, that I am more than a brain and body. Now, before we move there, the word I is an eidexical word. And the question is, what am I? In other words, when we now that we've established briefly that there are conscious states and properties, we need to now ask what possesses them, or what is a thing that is conscious. And quite frankly, I am conscious, but the question is, what am I? So this is a view known as substance dualism that I'll be presenting. And it is a view that I am a soul that has a brain and body. To elaborate, I am a soul. I am identical to my soul. In other words, I have a body. I don't have a soul, but rather I am a soul, and a body without a soul is nothing more than a corpse. And to be honest, actually, I've changed my views on this a few years ago, because I actually do now believe I have a soul. It's actually an orange Kia Soul, and it's parked in my driveway right now. And I bought that car just so I can make that joke. It's made for a very rich joke, if you will. So moving on. So if I am a soul, and if a soul is a material, then that it would follow that therefore I am immaterial. Moreover, if a brain and body are something that is something that is physical, then it follows that if I am a soul and my brain and body are physical, then I cannot be identical nor reducible to a brain and body. Now, let's look at the arguments for this point here. Again, using the law of identity. Now, if I am equal to a brain and body, let's start here, then human beings would be what you would call a mereological aggregate. And we can just use the word aggregate for short. And an aggregate is a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. So to illustrate, things like watches, cars, and Lego bricks are what we would call aggregates. They are a collection of various parts held together in a certain structure. Now, lots to be said here, but one of the first things to note is that for aggregates, they do not maintain what is called identity through change, because their existence is necessarily dependent on the structure and their parts. Let me illustrate. Take a tricycle. If you remove just one of the wheels from a tricycle, then quite literally a tricycle has ceased to exist and a bicycle has come into existence, which shows us that for aggregates, there's no identity through change. But let me push the point further. Suppose you take a car. And I don't own this car. This one was too expensive. I own the Kia Soul one. But let's take this car and let's change the tires on the car. And ask yourself, is it still the same car? Now, after you answer that question, now consider this. Suppose that we were to take this car and change over time every nut and bolt in the car, the windshield, the bumpers, everything. Then we give it a nice little shine. Now ask yourself, is it the same car? But one more time, before you answer that question, suppose we were to take all the parts that we replaced and put those back together. Now you have two cars. Now ask yourself, which one of these two cars is the original, if either one is? Now, regardless of your answer, I think the point is clear, and that's they both cannot be the original. And this is because aggregates do not maintain identity through change or part replacement. Okay, now with this in mind, here's the first argument. I have three of them. The first argument is known as the argument from identity through change. And it goes as follows. I am either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial soul. Premise 2, if I am a purely physical object, then I do not retain identity through change and part replacement. Now, which one of these two am I? Well, do I maintain identity through change? Let's find out. I think we intuitively, all know that we do. Suppose I commit a crime 7 and 10 years ago. It's purported that every 7 to 10 years, you replace virtually every cell in your body. Now, mind you, if we are nothing but purely physical objects and there is no soul, then it would follow that we do not maintain identity through change. So suppose a detective knocks on my door and says, Eric, we now have the evidence to convict you that you committed a crime 7 and 10 years ago. So I'm going to have to take you in. And I say, Jay, for those who don't know it, it's Jay Warner Wallace. And I say, Jay, look, man, we've known each other for a couple of years now. And, we both know that human beings are just purely physical objects, which means if you really want to find the guy who actually committed that crime 7 and 10 years ago, well, it's not me. Go find that guy, but good luck because he doesn't exist. And of course, he's going to look at me with a smile and say, no, you're going to jail. Now, I say this because, again, we all know that we do maintain identity through change. So if I do maintain identity through change, then it follows that I am not a purely physical object, and therefore I am a soul. Okay, second argument, the indivisibility of personhood. Excuse me, my mouth is extra dry today. Premise 1, same setup. I'm either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. Premise 2, purely physical objects can be divided in common percentages or degrees. Now, let me explain this. Things like being soft or hard are what philosophers call degreed properties, meaning they can be divided and they can exist and vary in percentages or degrees. So something that's soft can be softer or harder or louder or quieter. Now, contrast this with non-degreed properties, which are things that cannot be divided and cannot exist in percentages or degrees. So they are all or nothing kind of things. Take the property of being even as an example. The number 2 and the number 6 are both even numbers, but it would make no sense to say that the number 6 is, quote, more even than the number 2. This is because the property of being even is an all or nothing kind of thing. It either is or it isn't, and there is no in between. Now, with this in mind, let's look at and compare ourselves to purely physical objects. It would make sense to take a table and cut it in half and say that we have now 50% of a table. But if you were to cut me in half, say chop off my arms and legs, it wouldn't be fair to say that I am now 50% of a person. Now, mind you, you could say I have 50% of a body, but if I am still 100% a full-blown person, then automatically it follows that I am not a body, given that my body can exist in 50%, but I'm still 100% a human being. Now, some people might say, well, hold on, what about the brain? Well, I think the same thing applies. There is there are conditions known as Dandy-Walker syndrome or anencephalic disease, where some people are born with 50% of a brain, 70% of a brain, or there are procedures where doctors take out let's say 25% of a person's brain. So it makes sense to say that a person could have, say, 75% of a brain, but once again, they are still 100% persons. Now, they may lose functioning, but this only furthers my point. Even if I lose functioning, I don't lose personhood. So the question is the property of being a human person degreed or not degreed? Well, I think quite easily I could say that it is a It is a non-degree. And I think it's evident to say that I cannot be divided or come in percentages or degrees. I am a null or nothing kind of thing. Therefore, I am not a purely physical object, given that purely physical objects can exist and be divided in percentages and degrees. Therefore, I am a soul. Last argument is the argument from free will. Now, what is free will? I'll try and be brief here. Basically, it is being the originating source or first cause of your will or actions. Meaning you are not caused to act or will by something prior or external to yourself. I'll explain it this way. Suppose there was a bullet that penetrated a person's heart. Now, although the bullet is what penetrated the heart, we're not going to blame the bullet because we know that the bullet didn't act on its own, but was instead fired by the gun. But even then, we don't blame the gun because we assume that the gun was caused to fire by the person pulling the trigger. In other words, these two things are secondary causes, whereas the person here is the first cause of this chain of events. Hence, he was the one that caused the gun to fire, caused the bullet to fire that killed the person. And thus, we're going to blame this person as the first cause because they were the ones responsible as the initiators of the chain of event. Now, with this in mind, here's the argument from free will. I am either a purely physical object or an immaterial soul. Premise 2. If I am a purely physical object, then I do not possess free will. Now, Aristotle used this example to kind of explain the conundrum that I'm going to present. Aristotle said, if I move a rock with my staff and my hand moves a staff, but he asked the question, what moved me? Now, let's suppose there is no soul and no God. If that's the case, then atheism would be true, and that would imply that the law of causal closure is true. What is that? The law of causal closure is the notion that every physical event must have a physical cause. So that means no God or no souls can be involved when explaining physical events. Well, if this is the case, when we go back to Aristotle's question, what moved me to move the hand, to move the rock, and so forth, an atheist can say, well, a neuron firing within my brain caused my hand to move. And so because of this, I am the first mover. I have free will, and I didn't need a soul to explain this. But then I would say, hold on, no, time out, flag on the field. Remember that according to the law of causal closure, if there's no God, this law is going to be true. There's going to be no outside or external supernatural influences, which means everything must be explained by way of physical causes. Now, given that a brain firing is still a physical event, well, then it too must now have a prior physical cause. And at this point, you're now going to have only two options for the atheist. The first option is to say, okay, well, if he wants to preserve free will, say, okay, well, then this neuron firing was probably caused by another neuron firing. But of course, this only pushes back the goalposts, because then you have to ask, well, what made that neuron firing that caused the other neuron firing to fire? And he can say, okay, well, hold on. Maybe this neuron firing caused this one to cause that one. And he can keep doing this. But what you're going to quickly see is that at some point, you're going to go into this infinite regress and the action would never be accomplished. And it's going to crash your computer. No, so this option is simply not a viable option. Why? Because in order to get this chain of event going, you're going to have something that is going to start and initiate this process. But if you have an infinite regress, then this process would actually never happen and be able to come to fruition in the first place. So let's look at the second option, which is a final option. And that is however many amounts of neurons you want to posit, at some point, you're going to have to point to something that came prior and external to yourself that caused the neuron to fire, that caused the hand to move, that caused the staff to move, that caused the rock to move. But notice at this point, you are no longer the first cause in this chain of events, and thus free will can't exist. So if I do have free will, then we now have our third premise. If there's no soul, there's no free will. But if I do possess free will, well, that means a soul must exist, and therefore I am not a purely physical object. I am a soul. Now, here's an objection. Someone might say, but hold on, Eric. I don't believe we have free will. And first thing I would do is I would commend them and say, well, thank you for at the very least being logically consistent. And to no surprise, I have had atheists that were logically consistent and said that they don't believe in free will. And my first question is usually, did you freely come to believe that? Because if you don't have free will, then you can't tell me that you freely came to believe that you didn't have free will. And that leads into some problems. Let me just name two. Typically, an atheist will say something like they are free thinkers, which means that they are not bound by the shackles of religion and they are free to think for themselves. And then on the other hand, which we would call rational responsibility or intellectual integrity. And on the other hand, they'll say that, you know, we don't need God to be good. We don't need religion. We have a conscience. And they'll use slogans like science flies you to the moon, but religion flies you into buildings. And in other words, that we don't need God to be moral. We have this moral responsibility. Don't need to believe in God. So we'll call this moral responsibility. But remember, concerning the latter, that if we don't blame the gun and bullet because of what we saw earlier, the problem is that if there is no soul, then much like the gun or bullet, now you become caused by something else, and thus you're no longer the first cause, but you now become a secondary cause. And if you're the secondary cause, well, then you no longer can be held accountable for anything that happens because you don't have free will. In other words, if we don't blame the gun or bullet for the murder, then we can't blame the person if, like the gun or bullet, they too were caused by external factors beyond their control. What about more intellectual rational responsibility? Well, here is where we see that atheists might typically want to say something like, well, I'm an atheist for intellectual rational reasons. The problem is, if there's no free will, then you cannot take intellectual credit for what you believe any more than you can take credit for the color of your eyes or the color of your hair. It's not something you came to choose, but was something you were born with and had no control over. Which means, ironically, when an atheist tells me that they're a free thinker and they don't believe in free will, then I have to inform them that they can't be rational in what they believe, given that it's all causally determined. And if there's no free will, the last thing they can call themselves are free thinkers, because their thoughts and their beliefs are not free, they're determined. And then this, and I don't necessarily intend to make it bother them, but it's just stating a fact. If that's the case and there's no free will, then their reasons for being atheist are no more rational than the religious nut yelling on the street corner with a sign saying the end is near, because both persons came to a belief for which they had no control to believe otherwise. Now, if the atheist wants to affirm rational responsibility and moral responsibility, then he's going to have to affirm free will exists. But if he affirms that free will exists, then, he's going to have to affirm that the soul exists. But if he says, but I don't believe in the soul, okay, that's fine. Well, then you can't believe in free will. And if there's no free will, there can be no rational responsibility and no moral responsibility, which means if rational responsibility and moral responsibility exist, well, then lo and behold, I do possess free will. Therefore, I am not a purely physical object. Therefore, I am a soul. So just in summation, the importance, it's important to Christianity. Even the Bible tells us to love God with the mind. Second, if there's no soul, there's no resurrection, as we mentioned. Existence of the soul was defined as an immaterial substance that contains consciousness and animates the body. We focus on these 2 points, and we saw that the first is that that consciousness is not physical. Second is I am more than a brain and body. I am a soul. And for the first, we saw that there was 5 states of consciousness. And we saw that all the states of consciousness, based on the law of identity, are not identical or reducible to something physical like the brain. And we saw that causal dependence does not equate to identity. Moreover, this second point had 3 arguments I used: identity through change, the indivisibility of personhood, and free will, which we saw that in order to affirm rational responsibility and moral responsibility, you need free will. If you don't have free will, you cannot have these things. But on the other hand, if you do have these things, then you have free will. And if you have free will, then a soul must exist. Like Jody said earlier, you can check out more of my content, including the debates I've done. I've done a handful of debates on the existence of the soul. Recently did one on the topic, is God necessary for morality? And have done other various discussions on just apologetics and evangelism. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. That was a good presentation. I really enjoyed that. I've never heard those arguments stated to the conclusion. Therefore, I have a soul. I've heard all these things discussed, but that was really new to me and really, really profitable. Thank you. I wanted to point out something. I can see why the atheists don't want to affirm the soul, obviously, because it would destroy a naturalistic worldview. Have you found the same thing to be true?
Absolutely. In fact, I was in the process a few years ago. I've had to put this on the back burner, but I was in the process of writing an initial book, which I entitled "Why I'm Not an Atheist," and the subtitle was "An Analysis of the Logically Inconsistent, Philosophically Incoherent, Unjustified, Self-Defeating Atheist Worldview." I'll tell you how I really feel about it later, though. And basically what I argue, because what I've found in my experience is oftentimes when you're talking to a non-believer, it's as if their tactic to quote evangelize or deconvert people is to simply attack Christianity. But I found that attacking Christianity doesn't prove there is no God. It doesn't prove that God does not exist or Christianity is false. So rather than get in a defensive position, I've learned to do this myself, and I've trained others to show that it's appropriate to turn the tables, if you will, not in a deceitful way. But if someone says there is no God or doesn't believe in God, there will be implications that follow, one of which, as you pointed out, is naturalism. Now, I've had some pushback from atheists that say, well, I'm an atheist and I'm not necessarily a naturalist. Or some will say, well, I just lack belief in God. I'm sure you've heard that. And that isn't, and just because I have the label atheist, it doesn't mean that you can now know what I believe. And basically, I'll say this. While I may not be able to know what kind of music you like because you're an atheist, I do know that if you're going to be logically consistent as an atheist, there are certain implications and beliefs that will be entailed by your worldview. So to explain this, within epistemology, there are things known as epistemic chains, which is a notion that sometimes a belief A will logically imply belief B, which means that if you believe A and A implies B, then in order to be consistent, you're going to have to believe both A and B. However, I've found that if you can show that B is false, then it would follow that your belief, which it stemmed from, A, was false as well. So a quick example, say I have a friend who believes that all dogs are brown. That's his belief. Well, if he believed all dogs are brown, then an implicit belief that would come from that would be that the next dog I encounter would be brown. But if the next dog he encounters is brown, his implied belief is false, which means his base belief would be false as well. Similarly, if there was no God, then the only explanation you have to explain our existence is Darwinian evolution through natural selection, which is precisely a naturalistic perspective. Lots more to say, but absolutely. So even if they want to wiggle out, which I have found many atheists to try and do these days, you can still press them and say, yes, but on your view, this is what is most logically consistent. And until you can show me otherwise, I don't see how you would escape this dilemma.
Great, thank you. Another thing you mentioned, the professor who said, how can this pill affect my, states of consciousness, my immaterial being if I had one? And you also mentioned Alzheimer's disease, where changes in the body, illnesses can affect mental states and mental capacities. How would you say that the soul relates to the body and to the mind to explain those things from a Christian standpoint?
Yeah, great question. So, and I know I went through that kind of just, briefly. And so I'm glad we're having this question time. It would be like detuning a guitar or popping a string. If as I'm playing a song, the string pops, the song doesn't pop, right? The note doesn't pop, but my ability to convey what's in me is now inhibited or hindered because of the instrument I'm using. Same thing with even short-term memory loss. It would be like detuning my guitar as I'm playing it, right? In order to fix it, I'm gonna have to retune that bad boy. In the same way, you can look at the soul as a musician and the body as the instrument. I, as a soul that has a body, while I'm in this body, I'm going to be limited by its capacities and inhibitions and any of its defects that it has. So in this way, someone who has, let's say, Alzheimer's, well, again, given that we're believers, we believe in a body and a soul, but what's happening is a guitar, if you will, is being detuned. But this is also why at the resurrected state, we're going to have a glorified body that is not corruptible and perishable, as Paul put it.
Great. One last thing, or my last question for this series is about the spirit. The Bible sometimes talks about the spirit of man, not the Holy Spirit, which it also talks about. It's sometimes confusingly the spirit, but the spirit of man. How does the spirit relate to the soul? I've always had this question. I've never really heard a satisfying answer. What have you found?
Yeah, so this is one of the common questions that always gets brought up. This one and animal cells. So if you have that question, I don't mind touching on that one too. But those are really the two most popular ones. So there is a view known as a trichotomous view or a tripartite view of man. Before anyone throws rocks, I reject it, but not because I think people have a misconception of what this is. Let me illustrate. People say, well, I believe in a body, soul, and spirit. And I say, me too. And they say, okay, then you're a trichotomist. I said, no, I'm a substance dualist. And they say, but you believe in a spirit. I say, yes. Well, then you are. I say, no, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, you're not. And after that goes on for about 10 minutes, I say, well, let me put it this way. Do you believe in a mind? They say, yes. I say, oh, so you're a quadcotomist, not a trichotomist. And they say, no. I believe in a body, soul, and spirit, but I believe that the mind is part of the soul. I say, so you're telling me that you can have faculties of a thing belong to something else. And even though the Bible mentions a mind, you can attribute that as a part of one of the other three. Yes. Okay. So in the same way, I believe in a body and a soul, and I believe that the soul has a set of faculties. Think of like drawers, if you will, and these are have a natural grouping of capacities. Like my capacity to see is a sensation, and my capacity to taste lemonade is a sensation. But seeing the color red and tasting lemonade are two different sensations, but they're close enough to be grouped under the faculty of sensations. So my soul has various capacities, and one of those capacities, I would say, is a capacity of spirit. Now, here's another way to better understand this. When I'm talking to someone about this, I ask a trick question, and I say, what taste, when you eat food, what taste? Is it your taste buds or is it you? Now, some people say, well, my taste buds. Other people say, no, it's me. And I say, well, trick question, pray for me later. But it's a trick question because it's not an either or, but a both and. In other words, I taste through my taste buds. It's not my taste buds tasting or me or my taste buds without me or me without my taste buds. It's that I taste through my taste buds. So when I would say that the faculty of the spirit is the way in which we communicate with God. So if you were to ask me what prays, your soul or your spirit, I would say, just like the taste bud analogy, I pray to God through the faculty of my spirit, just like I taste lemonade through the faculty of my taste buds. So just like a body can have parts and components, so too the soul has parts and components. We have one body, but someone says they have two hands. Well, that doesn't mean they have three bodies. It means they have one body with different parts. And in fact, I would say that the body, as Dr. J.P. Moreland puts it, who's the man on this, where I've learned most of my stuff from his work, the body is an external realization of an internal structure. In brief, that basically means that your body, the reason you have the kind of body that you do is because of the kind of soul that you have. So I have a human body because I have a human soul, and a dog has a dog body because it has a dog soul. And yes, animals have souls. If you read in Genesis and you look in the Hebrew, it says God made the land nefesh, the land creatures with souls. So my body is an external expression of the capacities of my soul. So I have eyes, but my eyes don't see. My soul sees, but uses my eyes while embodied. Sure, if you pluck out my eyes, I'd go blind. But if you can put other eyes in that work, I would now be able to see, because it was never my eyes that saw. It was my soul through my eyes that saw, because my soul is what grounds all my capacities and faculties. So if I can study a body of something, I will be alerted to the kind of soul that it has. So when we look at the brains of human beings and animals, there are different developments and different parts of a human brain that are not found in a dog brain. And why is that? Well, because the soul develops something to utilize its capacities, and thus one difference of the many between animals and like dogs and humans is that, take for example, my dog can think and I can think, but I can think about my thinking, whereas a dog can only rise to the level of thinking. I can have desires and my dog can have desires, but I can have desires about my desires. I can even desire to desire something that I don't currently desire. So for example, I've counseled and discipled people, and they've said, Eric, I there's this, brother so-and-so at church that I can't stand, but I feel guilty about it. I don't want to dislike this person. I don't desire to love them, but I desire to have the desire to love them. So there's a hierarchy of desires. Nevertheless, we even see this playing out, that when we look at the brain, sure enough, the parts correlated, and I say correlated because it's like guitar strings or piano keys. There's a correlation, but they're not identical, correlated with these capacities, where the dog brain would lack them. So the body would be an external, a realization of what the soul is, and the spirit, as I mentioned, would be a faculty of the soul, not something separate from the soul.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Thank you. Jody, do you have anything? We can't hear you. You're muted.
Okay. Appreciate your presentation, Brother Eric. I noticed you said a dog has a soul. Now, obviously, a dog has conscience. A dog can have, desires. It can feel love. It can feel hate, just like a person can. But then there's maybe I get this term soul and spirit confused sometimes, because sometimes they're used interchangeably in the Bible. But when you're talking about the soul, are you primarily talking about our consciences, or are you talking about the part of us that goes on after we're dead?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this goes into some more nuanced views of substance dualism. When I say the soul, as I mentioned earlier, when I use the word I, it's an indexical word which refers to something. Like when I use the word here or there, I am making a reference point. So when I use the word I, the question is, what is exactly what you're asking? What does that refer to? And I'm saying that refers to the soul. What is a soul? It is an immaterial substance that contains consciousness. So consciousness is in the soul. It is not, which is to say that a soul is not merely consciousness. It is something that possesses consciousness. Because there are some views that think that the soul is just nothing more than the mind, but I would say, no, it's more than that. As I just mentioned, the soul is something that forms the body. It animates the body. It is you. It grounds your capacities, grounds your free will. It contains your mind. So that being said, my first point was that consciousness is not physical. And given that this is a case, because properties need to be grounded in something, then we'd have to ask what possesses the immaterial states and properties of consciousness. Let me touch on that. states and properties don't show up in the world by themselves. Like take the property of being brown or red or circular or triangular. I don't see redness floating around in the room by itself. Instead, I see objects that possess the property of being red. So when I'm driving on the freeway, I don't try to avoid hitting redness. I try to avoid a car that possesses the property of being red. In the same way, we can simply say that thoughts have thinkers. So the states and properties of the mind are grounded in conscious subjects. So we can say anything that is conscious, I would say automatically gets a free pass. It has a soul. Now, because you would need to ground these immaterial states and properties in some immaterial substance. Now, asking about heaven, this is a good question, because that's probably the third question, or maybe it can be a sub question to the animal thing, is, will animals be in heaven? I don't know, but I will say that the question revolves around the idea that souls are by nature eternal and automatically go to heaven. I don't think that's the case. I don't think just because something is a soul, it's therefore eternal and goes to heaven or hell. I think the soul is just it. In other words, most Christians, and I'm not saying you, I'm just most Christians, if you were to ask them what's a soul, the only answer you're going to get is the thing that goes to heaven, as if that's all it does, right? When it's much richer than that. Now, I do think we are eternal, but that's only because we're made in God's image. And I think it would be immoral for God to annihilate something that bears his image. Now, given that animals don't bear the image of God, that's where I say, will they be in heaven? I don't know. It'd be nice, but I don't think God is obligated to place them in heaven as he is obligated to place us in heaven, given, or hell. In other words, be eternal. But that's only because we bear his image, and he's not going to destroy something that is intrinsically valuable, given that it bears his image.
So do you, in a lot of your presentations, are you making a distinction between what the soul or conscience is, or are you saying our soul, our spirit is also part of our soul?
I'm saying that the mind is a faculty of the spirit. So kind of like your senses, or your body parts. When you ask, what part of your body tastes, it's your taste buds. So your taste buds are distinct from your eyes, because your eyes don't taste, your taste bud tastes, but they're still part of the same body. In other words, just because they're distinct doesn't mean that they're separate from. And I think sometimes people get confused there. So the mind is a faculty of my soul, and my soul is who I am. So I have one body, but I have two hands. So there's a distinction there. And while we are talking about three things, we're not talking about three separate things. We're talking about two things that belong to one body. Similarly, my spirit is a faculty of my soul, and my mind is a faculty of my soul, but they are all part and grounded in me, the soul as an immaterial substance.
Okay. All right. Well, I really got a lot to chew on, so I'm going to definitely review this YouTube video, and I will try to absorb it because I was interrupted, but I will definitely try to bring it back up and try to absorb it and chew on it a little bit. And I really do appreciate you being with us tonight.
Yeah, thank you. It was an honor. And yeah, I basically gave you like a whole semester's worth almost of metaphysics in like 30 to 40 minutes. So it is a lot to chew on. But that's why, I point people to either, the videos they can watch on my channel. I have like a 2.5 hour video where I go in through this in a lot more depth, or even better than any of that. I highly recommend, I don't have it on my desk right now, Dr. Moreland's book called Body and Soul, Human Nature and the Crisis in Ethics. Great book that covers all of this metaphysics and more. But yeah, it's quite a unique, intriguing topic, because it basically gets at who we are, which reflects, I would say, who God is, and reflects how because there's a lot of implications that goes into this, such as spiritual formation, discipleship, cognitive behavioral therapy, neuroplasticity, free will. For example, in Romans 7, you find a really interesting conundrum that Paul puts his finger on when he says, the good I want to do, I don't do, and that I don't want to do, I end up doing. And then he just comes out and says, this has made me realize that there's nothing good within me. But then he clarifies and says, that is my flesh. And then he says that there is a war waging between my inmost self, i.e. the soul, and the members of my body, his body. So automatically he's making this distinction regarding substance dualism and saying that within his flesh, there are sinful habits that his soul, needs to overcome. Again, that has implications towards free will, spiritual formation. Here's a quick application. This is why fasting can be very important and vital to the believer. Galatians 6:8 says that we want to feed the spirit, not the flesh, because if we feed the flesh, we reap the fruits of the flesh, whereas if we feed the spirit, we reap the fruits of the spirit. Which means that when we fast, we're not fasting so that we can learn to not eat. We're fasting so that we can deprive the body, the flesh, of its lustful passions, which that word lust literally just means cravings or strong desires for something forbidden. We prohibit the body from enjoying non-sinful things, if you will, in order to build our spirit and will to be able to resist the sinful things that we've been given into. In other words, if we want to control what we cannot control, we have to first master the things that we can control and don't want to. One last application. When I've done counseling with people, I say, here's a prescription you can do today at the grocery store. We've all found ourselves in the grocery line. We pull up to the grocery line, and then we look in our basket and we say, you know what? I really don't need this box of cookies, so I'm not going to take it. And what we do is we grab the box of cookies from our basket, and then we look to our right, we look to our left, make sure no one's watching, and then we place it in the candy aisle right next to us, and we put some candy on top of it so no one sees that we were too lazy to get out of line. What I tell people is, in that situation, here's what you do. You grab your item, grab your basket, get out of line, go back to where you found those box of cookies, and place them right back in the same spot. Now, someone might say, but I'm pressed for time. It's a long line. Right, that's the point. Is you're getting your body to do something it doesn't want to do. And that's exactly what you want to do. Is if you can't control the things that you can have the power to control, you're never going to be able to take control of the sinful habits and addictions that you have that you currently cannot control. This is precisely the principle behind fasting and spiritual formation. We submit and beat our bodies into submission, like Paul says, and we submit our members as living sacrifices to God, and we discipline our body in order to feed the spirit.
Hey, Eric, this is great stuff. I'm really enjoying this because it recently came up in our Sunday morning worship service. We were talking about the eternal state and the nature of body and soul. And I had also brought up that the Romans 7 passage where Paul says, I do the things that I hate. So he's kind of admitting that, or he's saying, and I think it's true of all of us, our soul being created by God and is uncorrupted, and it knows what the good is, but the body, the flesh, has the corruption of sin in it.
Yes.
And so there's that war. There's a war going on in my members, he says. And I think we all understand that. That's where guilt comes from, and conscience, because there's that inner kind of knowledge. And I think we can point to the atheists and say that that too. You have the image of God on you, and here's an evidence of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of little nuggets that he gives there that, I can spend hours talking about the stuff. I won't, but like one instance, he says, the good that there's good that I want to do, but I don't have the power to carry it out. Now that's very profound, especially when it comes to free will. And I find that people have a big misconception usually when it comes to free will. And they tend to confuse the freedom to will with the freedom to act, or the freedom to will with the freedom to do. And here's the easiest way I've learned to explain it. You have desires, you have wills, and you have actions. Suppose I wake up from surgery, and as I wake up, I see to my right, there's a cup of water by my hospital bed. The next thing that happens is there's a desire of thirst. And after this desire of thirst, I form the will to lift my arm and grab the cup. Now, suppose, however, that unbeknownst to me, my body is still under the paralytic effects of the anesthesia, which means that when I desire and then form the will to lift my arm, nothing happens. And I get kind of confused. I'm like, wait a minute, I know I just willed to lift my arm, but it didn't work. Now, what this shows us is there is, first of all, clearly a distinction between a desire, a will, and an action. And it shows us that merely having a will and desire to do something is not sufficient to bring about the action. That this is why you find drug addicts and alcoholics. It's not a question of whether or not they want to be better. It's rather a question of the fact that they don't have the ability or willpower developed to simply will themselves to be better. It's like a kid who tries to slam dunk like Michael Jordan and fails. Well, it's because he hasn't lived and practiced and exercised like Michael Jordan. By way of application, if we want to be and act like Christ, well, we have to live like him. We can't expect to be hated by our enemies and then look down on them and say, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. Why did he say that? Well, because look at the life he lived. What else would he say? I don't know about you, but if someone were spitting on me and cursing at me and trying to kill me, I'm not going to look down and say, oh, God, forgive them. I'm going to do something totally different. But here's this man beaten to death, literally, and half naked on a cross. And the first thing that crosses his mind about his enemies is to ask God to forgive them. What kind of guy is this? Who would do that? Well, a guy who's formed his soul in line with the order of God. And I can't do it, but I can't do it because I haven't lived like Christ lived. I haven't engaged in these practices and disciplines. And if we want to be better and be like Christ, well, then we have to live like Christ.
This brings up another thing that we discussed in our Sunday worship service, and that is the near-death experience. Gary Habermas has done a lot of great work on this. I see you nodding your head, so I'm going to assume that you're familiar with that at the very least, if not an expert. And when we see that there are veridical NDEs where people have brought back information that can be verified. So for example, the one woman floated up to the roof of the hospital. She saw a shoe. She described the shoe where it was. They finally sent someone up there. They found the shoe exactly where it was as described. So this is a veridical experience, experience of a near-death experience that demonstrates that this really did happen. She did have that. And I think this is an interesting way, since we have a record of those, and Gary has done that great work, and many others have as well. This suggests to me that it could be evidence for the soul, because what you have is, the body, the material part of the person has remained in that operating theater, but an immaterial part of them has left and traveled to another place. And in that other place, it was able to see or perceive, yet without eyes or ears, and able to learn and remember. So that means the mind and the faculties are not restricted to only being operating through the body. Have you thought about that? Have you ever thought about incorporating such an argument into your presentation or as part of your debate with the atheists? What do you think?
So first, let me first say I think NDEs are fantastic. I believe that many of them are verifiable. I believe many of them are legit. They're, in fact, I'm in the process of reading multiple books at once. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I have ADHD, so it's hard to focus sometimes on one thing. And I don't even necessarily read the books. I prefer audio because my mind is able to pay attention better when my hands are doing something. So usually I'll listen to an audiobook if I'm driving or cutting the grass or working outside in the yard. More than you asked. So sorry. That being said, one of the books I'm in the process of listening to or reading is called The Science of Near-Death Experiences, which is a really fascinating book. And I'm trying to see who, and it's published by, well, one is John C. Hagen, and then there's another one that I can't remember off the top of my head, but is published by, I don't see it here. I'm looking for it. That is published by a college, a university, a research group. In other words, it's not published by, a mom and pop, Baptist Bible First Church down the road. It's published by a legitimate academic press. And they only cover veridical experiences that near the experience have happened. Now, to your question about incorporating them, I haven't for a few reasons. The first, I'd say the most obvious, is because there's a lot I want to say, and while I do think near-death experiences are strong and verifiable, I think it would take me at least 1/3 of my time just to give a foundation and for people to understand, the process of how these things work. And given that most people haven't even looked into these things, they immediately dismiss the evidence because they're not willing to listen to it. In other words, just talking about the soul by itself can be a nauseating task. Like, for example, I've done, a lot, and I'm not bragging here. I'm just saying I've done a lot of these talks on the soul. And one I did, I think last week, this guy in his Facebook group said, "Hey, I'm going to be talking to Eric Hernandez. Give me your best objections and I'll present them to him." And a lot of people responded, but I never heard one objection. What I heard was something like, "Oh, there's no evidence for the soul," or "Oh, that's a ridiculous idea," or "Oh, I don't need to disprove something that has no." And I'm thinking, what, like it. I did a debate with Tom Jump. You can find it on my YouTube channel. Shameless plug. And in our debate, he says, when I brought the soul, he's like, "Oh, the soul is ridiculous. There's no evidence for it." And I said, "Oh, really?" I've learned that when someone does this, and it can be with any topic, with the resurrection, with Christianity, whatever, there's no evidence for it. Here's what you do. You take out your pen, make sure it has a loud click, and you give a nice little loud click on it, and you pull out some paper and say, "Oh, well, you're a smart guy. If you're going to say, make a statement that bold, then surely you have done research in this area. So, give it another click and say, so can you please tell me what are the top 3 arguments that you heard? And could you tell me why you disagree with him?" And he says, "I don't remember them." I said, "Oh, huh. But you know that they're not good." He goes, "Yeah." I said, "Okay." Okay, well, fine. I'll tell you what. How about this? What are the top 3 books you've read on the topic written by scholars? And he says, "Well, I don't think I've read a book on it, but I've read some articles and seen some videos." I said, "Okay. Well, okay. How about this? Give me the top 3 scholars that give arguments for the soul, and who are the scholars that responded to it that don't believe in the soul? Can you give them to me? Give it another click if you want." And of course, he's like, "Well, I don't know. It's been so long." I said, "Well, now I'm confused, because first you tell me that they're all ridiculous arguments. There's no evidence for it. Yet you couldn't name one argument, one book, or one scholar who does research in this topic. But you want me to take your word for it that they're just all bad arguments." I said, "I think I'm missing something." Now, if that being said, bringing in NDEs, multiply that sentiment times 36,000, now, if I will answer questions on it, like doing now in a debate, if someone wants to bring it up. And usually I have found that people do bring it up, even in debate. So I know in the back of my mind, somebody's going to bring it up sometime, sometime in the debate. It's always going to be a separation or distinction between soul and spirit, animals in heaven, and eventually NDEs. So I know that's coming. So because there's so much I have to say regarding what I think are the most powerful arguments that show in a logically deductive, straightforward manner that the soul exists, I usually let NDEs be something as a off the cuff kind of conversation during a Q&A or cross-examination. But again, that's not to say I don't believe in them. I think there's great evidence. I've heard and read countless stories of where, like you said, people who knew something they could have known, children who, one in particular, really quick. The little girl drowned in a pool. When she came back, she started talking about these, recalling, saying she went to heaven. That the parents thought nothing of it. And then one time, I think it was like a Thanksgiving dinner, the little girl approaches her mom and dad in front of the family, and the little girl says, "Hey, you never told me I had a sister." And the mom and dad look really confused, and they say, "What are you talking about? You don't have a sister." And they say, "No, I have a sister, and I met her in heaven." And trying to make sense of this, they said, "Do you mean your cousin Sophie?" They said, "No, not my cousin. No, my sister. I met her in heaven." At this point, the dad was really confused, and the mom's face turned white. And she said, "What was your sister's name?" And the girl said, "She told me you never gave her a name. In fact, she told me that you sucked her out of your tummy." The little girl was, 5 or 6 years old. She doesn't know what an abortion is. She doesn't know what a suction abortion is. She's just conveying what her sister told her in heaven. People think that all these NDE stories have these happy-go-lucky endings. The family got so embarrassed that they ended up getting a divorce, and just being embarrassed in front of the whole family. And again, this is a young little girl who has no idea what these things are, but yet she's reporting something that she could not have known. Anyways, yeah, so I definitely think they're great. I'm currently reading about some of them, but I've just omitted them both for the sake of time and just because just the topic of the soul itself is sometimes a hurdle to introduce, and adding that in, I think, only ruffles of feathers in a closed-minded kind of way. But yeah, I'm still very much willing to engage and talk about them.
All right, maybe that'll be a good subject for the next video. Maybe that'll be a good subject for the next video.
Yeah, that's a great subject. I'll have to gather some more notes on the couple books that I'm reading. But like I said, really fascinating stuff. The Science of Near-Death Experience is one of them. There's a few other ones. Imagine Heaven by John Burke is a really good popular level book, if you will. The one that I'm reading, The Science of Near-Death Experiences, kind of goes into a lot of the terminology and medical stuff that's even over my head, but it explains it. But the John Burke book, I think, has more of a theological applications and how we should understand and view these instances. Because one thing that's interesting, what I often hear from obviously people who've never looked into the work that's been done in this area is they'll say, "Oh, people just see whatever God they believe in." This is demonstrably not true. When you look at all the verified NDEs, virtually all the stories convey, I don't know the percentage, but it's mostly all the same type of things that they see. What happens is that first they see an image made of light, is how they describe it, whose essence is just love. And they feel this overwhelming sense of love and this incredibly bright light, so much so that one person said, "I'm glad I wasn't in my body, because this light was so bright that had I been in my body, it would have burned my eyes. It would have burned the retinas in my eyes." Now, there are instances where someone will come back who's not a Christian and say, "I saw Allah," or "I saw this." But when you ask them, what did it look like, they go back to this figure made of light who just emanated love. In other words, here's what you would expect if it's all just, baloney. You would expect the Hindu to come back and say, I saw the God with blue skin and 6 arms. And then you would expect this person to say, "And I saw this and this, and I saw," but they all relate the similar figure, even atheists and people from other religions. Now, they may attribute this to their God, but even what they attribute is not necessarily describing the God that they believe in. So again, there's just so many fascinating details that you look at it. It's just like either someone's playing the biggest trick ever made in history, or there's something to it. And of course, I would say the latter.
Yeah, that reminds me is one of the things that Gary Habermas says is some people, they don't see the being of light and love. They see a hell, something scary, something that terrifies them. So, and then yeah, again, we wouldn't expect that from, say, atheists, if that was just them seeing what they wanted to see. Nobody wants to see hell,
Yeah.
especially in a near-death experience. And oh, you're coming here, aren't you?
Yeah, atheists have had near-death experiences. Blind people who are born blind, came back and for the first time saw. Now, of course, their vocabulary was limited, and you might think, well, how do you know that? Well, how do they describe? Here's one interesting fact, because some people will say they describe facial features of a person, and an atheist might say, well, yeah, but blind people tend to use their hands to feel, so they could have described what they felt. Yes, but you don't feel freckles. And these people born blind describe faces with freckles. Of course, they don't call them freckles, but in other words, they're describing something that you're not gonna visualize by feeling. So again, lots of just fascinating details that I just think are just mind blowing. That really kind of just gets you excited about heaven.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think that's a good stopping point. We want to thank Eric for coming on the program. What a great job you're doing out there. Please check out his YouTube channel and the Texas Baptists. And if you're in the state, you should attend one of those unapologetic conferences I've been. It's a great place to go. And they, we really need more people to be doing apologetics, more people in the church. So, thank you, Eric, for coming out, and good night, everyone.